Hey, this is Ramon. Welcome back to my channel, Alpha 4. And today we're going to be talking about St. Augustine's Confessions. Before we get going, please hit that little bell. Please like, please subscribe, please comment down below. I'd love to hear your comments as I go through this video, and feel free to ask me questions or explain things to me that you think I got wrong. Love to have a conversation with you all. Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about St. Augustine's Confessions. Here's the summary. St. Augustine was a 43-year-old man in 397 AD when he finished his book, The Confessions. The book is the story of his conversion from a skeptic to a Catholic. In Book 1, you have two main themes. Theme A, Augustine goes over the sins of his infancy. For the reader, this analysis is too basic and doesn't cover anything we don't already know, to the point that it comes off as almost patronizing or insulting. That is not to say that it wasn't entertaining, as it reminded me of Frankenstein's monsters narrative, and made me actually wonder if maybe Mary Shelley actually took some inspiration from Augustine's Confessions. And B, in his examination of the sins of his childhood, he was again a bit odd and a bit scrupulous. As much and many of his so-called confessed sins are things that the church does not or has not considered sins. It isn't until his confession starts to talk about the sins that he did during his teens and adulthood. It isn't until then that the book begins to resemble what you think of when you hear the words confession, or even what other people who have read his writings claim it to be. Let's get into the next chapter. So Book 2. Here, Augustine writes of his sins as a teen adolescent and the beginnings of his struggle against the sins of sensuality. We hear how his mother worried for his soul and warned him against fornication and adultery, but his father only seemed to encourage his inclination to these vices and even seemed proud of his son's inclination to sin in this way, while Augustine, to his friends, made up sins he didn't even commit to seem popular and cool to them. And while Augustine is writing this, he's very ashamed. He's very ashamed of his father's encouragement of his sins, and he's very ashamed of his own propensity to sin. The fact that he would even lie and say that he committed sins that he didn't actually commit bothers him immensely. In chapter 2 is where the book turns to the first crime a modern audience might see as an actual sin, though a minor one at that, as he writes how he stole some pears with a group of his friends. He takes the time to say that he didn't do this for hunger or even for pleasure, as the pears were not that tasty, but that he did this for the thrill of doing something he knew was wrong and for the pride of camaraderie with his friends. But when reading it, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense that way, because how could he know that the pears weren't very good before he stole them? He's putting the end result before the sin is committed, as showing how or why he committed the sin. He then touches on the problem of relativity and perspective, in pointing out how things can be wrong in one moment but correct in another. Then we get to Book 3. And here, after falling out with his friends who had become malicious and cruel at this point, as teen boys tend to do, he falls in love with philosophy after reading Cicero's Hortensius. Honestly, I haven't heard of that book before, and I've read a lot of philosophy, and I'm actually a fan of Cicero, so I don't know that particular work. Maybe it's one of those lost works. But instead of becoming a Christian after this burst of intellectual fervor, he instead joined a Manichaean nature cult. His rejection of Christian theology stemmed from his attempt to read the Bible, following the joy and intellectual stimulation he felt from reading Cicero. He found the Bible boring, its literary style lacking, its prose to be tiresome, But more than that, he found the stories themselves to be unbelievable when taken literally, which is the only way he understood people who believed the Bible took them. So, with his studies of nature worship, he soon became a soothsayer and fell into astrology before discovering in his practice and his pursuit that horoscopes and astrology were all fake and its accuracy left up to random chance, leaving him disenchanted with both Christianity and occultism. So he then becomes a skeptic, and there's hints that maybe he becomes an academic at this point. And here, academic is not just the title academic, it's actually occult. So here, academic is kind of means a group of people that hold on to a certain kind of skeptic philosophy. I also want to take a second to speak on Cicero here. I actually have some of Cicero's speeches. When I read them, though I found them entertaining, they were a little boring. So it's kind of interesting that Cicero was what got him going, and yet he found the Bible boring. The first time I read the Bible, I didn't find it very boring, but the first time I tried to read Cicero, kind of did find. So now we get to book 4. Again, broken up into 2 sections. Augustine begins teaching rhetoric and takes on a concubine in the city of Tagaste. He is happy, and this would have remained his life. That is until his friend died, very much his best friend. The sickness was sudden and unexpected, but lasted longer than one would wish, leaving his friend's family a chance to baptize him before his death. Also, apparently without even getting his consent to do so. And while both men shared their beliefs with each other intimately, the friend who was dying would not let Augustine make light of the baptism at the risk of their friendship. So Augustine begrudgingly acquiesced. Then, soon after, when his friend died anyway, Augustine was devastated, forcing him to leave his life to run away from the memories of his dead friend. Now, there seems to be, when you read it, some undercurrent, some themes there that could hint at something more, but the book never gets into that. Then we get to the second part of this chapter, which is here Augustine takes the time to write on the limits of human knowledge, limits of scientific pursuits, and on his realization that beautiful or poor speech doesn't make something spoken true or false. Basically, even years later, when Augustine is writing this, the memory of his dead friend is so strong that he immediately changes the subject, is how it sounds like. Then we get to book 5, and book 5 is just one chunk. I'm saying book because that's how it's listed. It's listed as books, but for the sake of the video, we can call them chapters. Augustine, in his confession, states that at this point in his life, he had become a professor at the University of Carthage, where he encountered Dr. Faustus, a Macedonian bishop. But he leaves Faustus and Carthage for Rome due to the disrespectful students of Carthage. They would, go to class late. They didn't have a lot of work ethic, so he didn't like the way that the Carthaginian students were behaving. There were a lot of class clowns, that kind of thing. So he went to Rome. But this move didn't work for him the way that he wanted to, as he finds the Roman students, while being more disciplined, to be more greedy than the Carthaginian pupils, and too Machiavellian for his liking. So he moves on to Milan, where he meets Bishop Ambrose, whose homilies he finds intellectually stimulating. It is here that he gives up literalism when interpreting the Bible and finds faith, as he learns to look at religious text through Catholic understanding and tradition. He begins to see the analogy, allegory, and metaphor in the Bible, and by doing so, he starts to see the truth in it. The first chapter really does sound very Calvinistic. When I got to this part, I was like, how can any Calvinist make claims to St. Augustine as he's clearly looking at the Bible metaphorically through the eyes of tradition. And later when he starts getting into his love of Catholicism and why he's becoming a Catholic, I don't see how any Protestant can lay claim to St. Augustine like they like to do. Then we get to book 6, or chapter 6. And it is here that we get to stuff that is more understandable as sin. Augustine took on 2 different mistresses. He had a bastard child out of wedlock and got engaged by arrangement to a good Christian girl who was too young for marriage. In the confession, he says that he was miserable in his sin, and his only solace were the conversations, or the good conversations he had with 2 of his friends at that time who he was very close to. As in fact, they were so close that as a group, the 3 of them had considered taking vows of celibacy together, and that they would also take part in or start a type of philosophical monkhood. But they didn't pursue it or didn't actually commit to it because they realized that the women in their lives would not approve, or at least would not join them. Anyway, then we get to chapter 7, or book 7. And here, Augustine discovers Platonism in his readings, which brings him closer to Christianity, as many consider Socrates to be a proto-Christian, or sometimes called a pre-Christian, and that his ideas on forms are compatible with Christian theology, and that the Platonic ethics are compatible with Christian morals. And for those that don't know why Socrates and Platonic or Platonism go together, Plato wrote on Socrates. Almost everything that's about Socrates was written by Plato, and Plato's works, almost all of his works, star Socrates as the main character. There's another person that wrote about Socrates named Xenophon, and he has his own view of the trial, of the apology. And at the same time, the students that would follow from Platonism, Aristotle, have their own claim to fame. The prodigy of all that, the result of all that being Alexander the Great. It is here in this second part that at the age of 30, that the problem of hypocrisy begins to bother St. Augustine. Something most teens and preteens run up against in our current era. In his pondering on this issue, the problem of evil is also addressed. Though in this chapter, he just skims the surface of the problem. Yet he still does a good job of stillmanning the argument. Then we get to chapter 8, and chapter 8 can be divided into 5 talking points. In this chapter, in this book, Augustine hits on the theme of conversion, and takes the time to tell several conversion stories of famous saints and relevant to him. Going back to an earlier thread within this book about how different mature faiths express themselves, and they express themselves differently and bear different fruit. For instance, his mother's mature faith expressed itself in devoutness and obedience, while Simplicianus's and Ambrose's faith's maturity was demonstrated in their patience and understanding. The second thing that comes through here is that by now Augustine was coming to an understanding of faith. Yet, while finding Christianity to be true on an intellectual level, he was still not a Catholic, and he was still not baptized. Now at this point in his life, during this point that he's confessing, he was now going to church regularly. He claims that the reason for his hesitation to be initiated into the faith is that he couldn't let go of his sins and habits so easily, as his sexuality, pride, and his career success, and here I think he means monetary success, still had a hold of him. Third thing here is that Augustine begins to discuss with his reader his concept of God. He explains that God is intangible and inconceivable, and that he is not and that he, meaning God, is not a created being, and therefore God has no space or material matter, that he is not inside of time. And he will come back to his understanding of God later on in the book, but these ideas are very strong and they're very interesting. And they're ideas that I happen to already believe, so I thought that was kind of cool. I did notice that a lot of the books that he was interested in, such as the Platonic stuff and the Stoic philosophy, are also books that I myself have read. So it's kind of interesting that thousands of years apart, we still come to the same conclusion by reading the same books. So that's interesting because later he'll talk about how the opposite happens a lot of times. Then we get to the fourth theme, or the fourth part of this book 8. It is here that Augustine deep dives into the origin of evil, as man is that origin, not the devil, as dualism is a false belief, incongruent with the truth. He explains that animals are without reason and without a high degree of rational self-awareness, so that no matter what an animal does, it cannot be evil, because an animal cannot willingly of its own free will go against its own nature. Or, if it does go against its nature, it cannot go against its conditioning. But we as humans, as moral free agents, can. From that amazing point, Augustine then writes poetically of the ebb and flow of nature, the circular nature of life, and of the endless cycle of sin and redemption. He explains in detail how pain and pleasure feed into each other, and how one seems necessary for the other. And he explains that while this dualistic way of seeing the universe is easy on the mind, that it is nevertheless a false narrative. And that in fact it is this false narrative, this duality of nature, this false dichotomy of nature, not God, that leads to the necessity for forgiveness and reconciliation. So it is the mistake that humans make by prizing fame, community, monetary wealth, and physical possession over God that causes the need for forgiveness and reconciliation. God isn't causing that. It is our desire for those things that is causing that, in Augustine's opinion. Here he explains his version of nature versus nurture, which he calls nature versus spirit. And that's very important. And this is again more influence from his from the Platonic ideas that he agrees with here on forms. He then confronts the problem with the dualistic systems that are presented to us and uses the fact that one person, one will, can have multiple conflicting as well as competing desires. And he uses that fact of multiple desires going in multiple directions to demolish the equation of duality. So in Catholicism, we're not worried about the devil. It's not that we don't believe he exists, we just don't believe that he's powerful. He's not equal to God in any kind of way. It's not a dualistic system in Catholicism. Then we get to the fifth part, and it is here that a voice of a child tells Augustine 3 times to take and read. And so he does. He reads from the Epistle of St. Paul and finds a verse relative to his life at that time, at that current time. And his friend does the same thing. Interestingly, earlier in the book, he talks about how those things can happen through coincidence, or how you can read any amount of poetry and the reader of the poetry will read a line that's directly related to their life, yet the person who wrote it hundreds, if not thousands of years earlier never even thought of that situation, didn't have that person in mind when they wrote it. How random chance and probability works. Like those kind of themes from earlier in the book, he then re-examines, but here he accepts it as the truth. And this child that talks to him is this very powerful moment where Augustine has accepted Christianity as true, but he hasn't converted. So he goes away on vacation with these 3 friends, and he just goes off and he goes to a tree I'm not sure what kind of tree it is. I think it was a fig tree. I'm not sure. And he just cries. And while he's crying, he hears a child's voice telling him to look for the answer, to read. And it says it 3 times. Take and read. And that's what he does. All right, so then let's get to book 9. Book 9 can be broken down into 2 sections. Here, halfway through the book, is where we get to his conversion. Once he decides to become a Christian Catholic, he and his 2 close friends go off on a holiday to study scripture and read philosophy. Then, at some point, possibly a bit later, all 3 are baptized, possibly by Ambrose. But the chapter does not end on that high note. Instead, we read that within a few years, his 2 closest friends, his son, and then his mother die at different times by different ailments. At this point, Augustine asks the reader to pray for his parents. After a time of intense grief, Augustine begins looking for God directly. It is here in this book that he explains that at some point in his life, he came to the realization that nothing created is God, that he is not the air, and that he is not the sky, and that the sky is not heaven, that God is not the universe, nor the cosmos, nor anything in it or of it as he created it. And this is a big revelation and a big shock to the system for St. Augustine, and it kind of drives him forward from this point. Augustine then starts examining himself. This is the first of 3 long tangents that seemingly have nothing to do with the rest of the book. For the patient reader, you will be rewarded with some great ideas. For the rest of us, I recommend switching to the audiobook at this point, as it will help you get through his longer diatribes and ponderings. He begins his examination of self by realizing the limits of language, of human knowledge, and of human memory. Then he comes to the realization that intelligence and memory are not the sole unique identifier of human beings, as animals too can have higher levels of memory and intelligence, and yet not be truly sentient. While an individual human can have lower than average intelligence or memory, even less than some animals' averages, and still be considered sentient. So he started looking somewhere else, other than the mind or language, for this unique identifier in his search for God. And this goes back to a few chapters ago, back when he was examining what makes humans so unique. Now he comes back around to this, and now it's like, okay, wait, some animals can be more intelligent than others, so there has to be something else going on. He shocks himself when he states that just as God is not a man or a woman, as God has no physical gender, God is not a physical mind, nor an emotion. God is not Mother Nature, and he is not a sense perception. At this point, he's only been able to see God in shapes. He starts off with the man in the sky, the cloud thing, and then he starts seeing the incorporeal, the God that's shapeless. But then he has trouble dividing good and evil. He's like, how can there be 2 separate forces? And he was seeing them as 2 physical things. And now he's come to the realization that there is no physicality here, that it's a pure being, pure essence. So this is his evolution of thought, and this is kind of where, with religious people, we see their evolution of understanding happen. So he's kind of going through that same process and spelling it out very explicitly. Second part of this chapter, and this chapter has about 5, we broke it into about 5 sections, 5 talking points. The second talking point here is that after a very long, circuitous and circular tangent about the mind, better suited to a science book, to a science theory book, than a discussion of theology or philosophy, St. Augustine comes back around to the topic at hand, now presenting the reader with a common complaint of ex-believers, the nuns and duns as we would call them today. That is, if any singular religion is actually true, then why doesn't God just make everyone believe that religion? And if the Bible is actually true, then why not tell all people the same story with the same holy book. Even the Bible is a collection of different books with different theologies, philosophies, and perspectives. So why can't people just know which is the truth when they hear it? By just simply hearing it, by just listening to it. And you'll get this complaint a lot from a lot of atheists online and a lot of agnostics as well. Augustine just simply says that that's the wrong way to think about it. Augustine then answers that question, and his answer might seem extremely disappointing to the anti-theist who might be listening to this or who might read this book. His answer is this, that God is not an emotion or a feeling. God has no image or shape, as we understand dimension and mass. That God never changes. Only our understanding of God changes. So, as our understanding of reality changes, so does our understanding of God. And as our morality evolves and grows, so does our understanding of God's law. Anyway, let's continue on to point 4. Augustine then challenges himself, and thus the human race, with the goal of perfection. And for him, that includes the pursuit of chasteness against his temptations of sensuality and gluttony, against futile curiosity and gratification of the eye, against distraction and vain entertainment. His understanding at this point in his journey of faith is that those distractions and pursuits of worldly pleasure is sin. So for him, sin is no longer simply error. For him, sin is the distractions of life in the pursuit of worldly pleasure. His fifth talking point then in chapter 10 is he then continues his search for God, realizing that God exists outside of time, for even time is a creation. And I know it seems like he's hit on this multiple times, but in actuality, he's going through his evolution on how he came to this conclusion. This whole confession could be seen as a proof text in a way. He realizes that for truth to be true, it must always be true. Otherwise, it is only temporarily true. Here meaning partially true or conditionally true, and therefore not the real truth. Therefore, since God is truth, he cannot be subject to time. And if he's not subject to time, he exists outside of time and thus created time, because time too is a creature. Augustine ends this chapter by adding that those who ask, what did God do before creation, are in error and are asking the wrong question, because before God created time, there was no time. Book 11. The beginning is wisdom, and wisdom is the beginning. Here Augustine begins his examination of time. Time is relative, and to speak of time philosophically leads to many difficulties. As the past is gone, the present is fleeting, and the future hasn't happened. Therefore, prophecy seems to be the ability to read the past to predict the future based on current data. It seems as if the constant present is all there is. But to talk of the present is to talk of the past. For the moment it comes, it also passes, and then immediately ceases to be. The question that usually follows such revelation, such as, why not just make people eternal? Why create evil? And if not create, then why allow evil? Or to word it another way, why permit suffering? These questions show a fundamental misunderstanding of God. Point B, the second point of this chapter, is that from the moment you are, you exist in the past. And one day you will cease to exist in the future. This puzzle leads to Augustine's objections against the existence of objective time. To him, all time must be relative. He comes to the conclusion that either only forms are real, or that forms, that is, the spiritual, is more real than the physical. That is more real than corporeal matter. This is Augustine's argument for impressions, an anti-Stoic perspective, in my opinion. He feels that the goal, when it comes to knowledge, especially esoteric knowledge, should be to be content to know without knowing. Then we get to the third and final point of Book 11. Augustine comes to some conclusions about God. He realizes that God is formless, timeless, and constant. In realizing this, he also comes to the conclusion that formlessness is not nothingness. Then he begins to ponder creation and nothingness. He asks, what is change and what is consistency? Then we get to Book 12. It's broken down into 2 talking points. The first is this. He begins by examining the 2nd verse of the Bible. And Augustine asserts that the heaven Genesis 1 is speaking of is not truly eternal. That is to say that the heaven most common people think of and speak of cannot be eternal. For even if it has no end, it does have a beginning. And to be considered truly eternal, one can have no beginning and no end. Augustine questions whether heaven may have an intellect, or that heaven may even be an intellect, as the heaven of the Bible is clearly not the sky, nor the atmosphere. Again, and he also says not the wind. Again, we get into his understanding of Plato's forms. Augustine's view is that creation was the creation of the concept, not the physical earth we live on now, which is just a mere derivative of the form. So, from that perspective, he re-examines the line in the beginning and finds it to mean the beginning of wisdom, not the beginning of time, as time clearly existed before mankind was created. Therefore, time in the Bible would be time from our perspective, not from God's perspective, and we could only recognize time once we had an intellect, and that is the wisdom to understand the concept of time. Here it becomes obvious to Augustine and to us, the reader, that for this interpretation to be true, we must acknowledge that the mortal perspective and human opinion is flawed, because we can and do come to different conclusions even when presented with the same facts. And we must acknowledge that paradoxically, 2 things can be true at the same time. An item can be both hot and wet, or an item can be both relatively large and relatively small, depending on your perspective. This is how paradoxes can be true. From here, Augustine continues his search for God, trying to define what God is, so that he can know what or whom he is looking for. He comes to a few conclusions. First, that God is absolute simplicity, and second, that if you believe in the Trinity, it is easy to find evidence for this belief in the Old Testament. Third, but to do this and to recognize this, you have to stop thinking of God as a physical being. This becomes a discussion about the Trinity. Then we get to chapter 13. This is the final chapter in this book, or if you will, the final book in Augustine's Confessions. We, with Augustine as our guide, then take a look at Genesis and the Bible as a whole through the lens of the Holy Spirit. Here, Augustine takes an odd, almost contradictory look at the Genesis narrative, and specifically at the creation story as pure metaphoric analogy. To him, when it speaks of God creating the world, it is talking of the inspiration and creation of the biblical stories. That if looked at from this perspective, then all life and creation is the Bible itself. This is looking at reality and all of existence as the book of God. Thus, the sea represents the chaos of the irrational mind, such as paganism. The dry land representing impiety, such as atheism. The beast of the sea representing miracles, bearing fruit representing good works. That man here, at this point in the story, of creation, is represented as a single creature, neither male nor female, without race, without ethnicity, etc., etc. Adam and Eve then come to represent every human. First in Adam, when we have one will, then in Eve, when we have two wills, and with the snake, a third nature to contend with. This would be three competing and conflicting desires. Then those competing desires also have conflicting desires within them. Then we get to their children. And in their children, we are able when we are passive, rational, and obedient. And we are Cain when we give into our animal natures, slaying the able within, and then we lie about it. That this man represents all humankind, and we are that singular man. Just as many different cells make one body, each living and dying with its own experience, but still one body. Augustine then asserts that nothing in the Bible prevents his figurative understanding or interpretation. While on the other hand, if you don't allow for this type of allegorical understanding, you limit the Bible to mythology and philosophy, and you subject it to falsehoods of reductions to the ridiculous. But then he acknowledges that some will ask, why have the truth delivered in this way? His answer, or opinion, on the matter is that it is presented in this way because the mind, the body, and the soul each needs to be fed in their own ways. That some people need a literal understanding to believe, while the ignorant and unbelievers need sacraments, initiation rites, miracles, and portents, that is, prophecies, to believe. Some types of people need the figurative represented literally, in such action that can be repeated and understood to nourish and flourish like a planted seed. So here, your mind is the soil, and the reality of the world we live in is the manure needed to fertilize the seed of faith. For those who understand these allegories and analogies for what they are, that is truth, that this is a blessing for the faithful. It takes inspiration to do good works, and that the Holy Bible is a great work, that it is a record of our understanding of God, of our relationship and interaction with God, and interactions with God, that this book is a record of our inclinations, and that it shows that our immediate impulse is to do wrong, but that human works, be they good or bad or good, are only temporary. But these works, when taken collectively as a whole and from a great enough perspective, are not just good, but very good. And to accept this, we must accept that God is absolute. We cannot put our standards or our morals ahead. Otherwise, from our perspective, things can look terrible. But from a great enough perspective, things look very good. And B, the second talking point here is not actually in the text, but it's something that's within the text. And that's something that I should acknowledge here. That is, while his view on the Bible may seem very novel and very modern, even progressive to the uninitiated, St. Augustine's view on women lacks a touch of modernity. As for me, I enjoyed the book, though parts of it were long and needlessly tedious. Overall, this book is very enjoyable, but I can see why there are many abridged and summarized versions of this book. Yes, Augustine has a tendency to go off on tangents, even though he does do a good job of tying everything back in together at the end. I was most interested in finding out that many of the ideas that I hold about the Bible and about God, even though I've never read St. Augustine before this, either have their their origin or have their claim to fame from Augustine's statements on these ideas in his Confessions. And so that's it. Peace, like and subscribe. Please comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. I don't know if I'm going to be putting this out in parts or as one big piece, but I hope you all enjoyed it. Please make a reply video. Please comment down below. I'd like to turn this into a discussion.